Thank you. Welcome to my talk, Balancing Flexibility and Complexity in River. So your first question is probably, what is River? River is, simply put, my Wayland compositor project, but that begs the question, what is a Wayland compositor? I know some of you may already be familiar, but I'm going to briefly explain what Wayland is. Wayland is a protocol for communication between a compositor and clients. And these clients, the reason for this protocol to exist is to enable multiple clients at once, multiple programs on your computer, for example, Firefox, a terminal emulator, a video player, to gain access to the input and output hardware of your computer in a nice way. I mean, only one program at a time can have access and exclusive control of the computer's display. And so there has to be one program that does that task and then negotiates acquiring a buffer from Firefox and a buffer from your terminal emulator and a buffer for your desktop background and compositing all those buffers together into the image that you see on your screen. And likewise, your keyboard input can only be received by one program at a time, and something needs to decide which program should currently receive that keyboard input. Same with the mouse. So that's the task of the Wayland compositor. Examples of existing compositors would be GNOME, KDE, Sway, and River, my compositor. And you may have already also heard of X11. Wayland is an alternative to the X11 windowing system. It's a different protocol with a different architecture. If you're wondering why Wayland should exist, I'm going to give a very brief example of how something works in X11 versus how it works in River, or how it works in Wayland. And this demonstrates one of the core principles of Wayland, which is that Wayland is about policy over mechanism. So on X11, how do you implement a screen locker? Well, the first thing you do is you write a client that requests all the keyboard and mouse input. It just takes it all from all the other clients. And then you draw your window on top of everybody else's windows. That's about it. That's all you have to do to implement a screen locker on X11. But there's a problem. The server has no idea that this is a screen locker. It doesn't know to treat it specially. There's a problem handling, like, what if something else also wants all the keyboard and mouse input at the same time? What if it crashes? Then your screens become unlocked because all your other windows are visible, nothing's grabbing the keyboard input anymore. It's not really that secure. On Wayland, we can do a bit better. Instead of having all this mechanism, we instead use a policy-based approach. The client informs the Wayland compositor that this client is a screen locker. Then the server tells the client, yeah, draw a buffer of this size, it'll cover the whole screen, don't worry. The client just draws the buffer, and the server also is responsible for restricting input to the screen locker client. This has got some nice properties because the server now knows it's a screen locker. That means that if the screen locker crashes, the server can keep the session locked, and there's no more security hole. So this is a nice, concise example of why policy over mechanism can be very beneficial in this kind of ecosystem. So that's why I kind of ended up writing a Wayland compositor instead of an X11 window manager. I think Wayland has got some real advantages over X11, and I was also interested in trying something new. And so my Wayland compositor project is River. This started during the 2020 lockdown as I had a lot of free time and wasn't really happy with the current options were available for Wayland compositors. This is also my first SIG project ever. It's been going for, I guess that's over 2 years now. I'd never really written anything serious in Zig, only like a couple of lines before I started this project. And so I learned as I went along. And if you stick with it, it can go a long way, I guess. I've been very happy with Zig as a language for this project. Although I'm not going to talk too much about why I chose Zig in this talk. I have given another talk on Zig Showtime, one of the first Zig Showtime talks, about why I chose Zig over Rust and C and the other options for this problem space. So if you're interested in that kind of discussion, you could go check this talk out. So let's get a bit more into depth into what River is. River is a Wayland compositor that makes some different decisions on how managing a window the Wayland compositor also is what determines how your windows get managed on your screen. And so it makes some decisions about how this is done properly. Of course, I'm currently running River, so we can switch to out of this talk screen, and we can now just open up some windows and whatnot. That font size is really small. Let's make that bigger. So
Did you write the editor too?
your editor is Cocoon. I think Laura's just mentioned that. Sorry, this is. Lloyd's also mentioned I'm used to split keyboards, and this is not a split keyboard. Yeah, muscle memory is all gone right now. I'm sorry, guys. Here we go. We've now got the man page for the river.utl command line utility. And this is how you control and configure River. It all happens over this single utility. And we've just got a bunch of different actions you can do. You can close windows. You can add a title of a window to the float filter. And this means if you start the window, it will start in floating mode. You can also spawn a random program or swap the next and previous views. So let's take another quick example just to give you a bit more of a taste of like what River's about. Let's take a look at what the example configuration looks like. So most of the configuration is usually just defining key bindings to do separate things using this river.ctl utility. The configuration is all just a shell script, as you see here with this bin/sh. And so we can create a mapping to spawn our terminal emulator or close the currently focused view and just do all these very basic things. This is very simple. However, there are some issues with this approach that I'll go into later in this talk. This has worked great so far for the base feature set of River, but it's starting to hit its limitations. And I want to explore how we can move beyond the simple model and what the best path forward is to more flexibility. So back to our slides. That's the core interface to River. Now, one special thing about River is that the tiling behavior that you see is determined through a user-provided executable that's separate from the compositor process. The compositor asks this executable what layout the window should have, and the executable replies with the compositor sends the list of windows to this layout generator, and the layout generator replies with the layout of the windows. And so you can see if I spawn increasingly more terminals, they follow a specific layout. And this is determined by the layout generator. We can also go look at this program, of course. Sorry, I don't know why the font is so small. I think the capture card is messing up the DPI settings. This is now the default layout generator provided by River. And this program's only about 300 lines, about 400 lines of code. And this defines the entire layout behavior of what happens when you spawn a window. And so it defines this pattern that's been followed, and it has several options you can configure. You can, for example, move the center line left and right. That's also handled by the layout generator, and do a few different other things. But the point is that users can put their own code in this binary to pretty much achieve whatever they want when it comes to laying out the windows in this very specific way. So that's quite useful. I don't know, I seem to close my presentation. Excuse me. That's one thing that makes River rather unique compared to the other Wayland compositor options. And so this initial feature set has now become relatively stable. And I've been using this as my daily driver for probably about 2 years now. And it doesn't crash on me regularly. It hasn't actually crashed in quite a while. Though people occasionally do report bugs, of course. I've been able to fix them mostly pretty quickly. And this means also that there are also other people who are using it. Do I have anybody in the audience who's using River currently as their daily driver? I see one. Yes, thank you, Matt Knight. Yes, there are also others. Matt Knight is not alone. There's an IRC channel with several active River users. There are dozens of us.
They're not my alts.
They're not all Matt Knight. And so the one thing that comes with a growing number of users is a growing number of feature requests. And as an open source maintainer, it's difficult to deal with what you want to do or what features you should implement and what features are better left unimplemented because they would just increase the maintenance burden too much. And so on this topic, I like to distinguish between objectively versus subjectively good features. this is, of course, a subjective viewpoint, but I think it's a useful distinction to make, and I'll try and demonstrate what I mean by this with some examples. So an objectively good feature would be being able to change the keyboard layout. That's a pretty base requirement. Another one would be having support for adaptive sync or variable refresh rate. That's just enabling stuff in your hardware. That's a no-brainer, kind of, this kind of thing. Support for touch and tablet tool input. A little bit more work to maintain, maybe, but it's a worthwhile feature. Also battery life, latency optimizations, this kind of thing. That's what I mean by objectively good features. And this is the main thing that's been implemented in River over the past year or so. We haven't really added any new window management paradigms over the past year, but there's been many small improvements to just enable edge use cases that were not possible before, and objectively good features were implemented. Subjectively good features would be something like, should moving the cursor over a window also shift the keyboard focus to that window immediately? This is something we currently have a configuration toggle for in River, because some people like it or prefer that the keyboard focus is not shifted immediately. It's kind of separate from the cursor focus entirely. That's how I personally prefer it. But enough people want it to be done the other way that I did cave and implement this feature quite a while ago. And now we've got a config toggle for this. We've got a few other of these toggles, and they're not too bad to have around, but there are examples of just subjective features. Another one would be, should the cursor be warped when shifting keyboard focus between windows with the keyboard? So you might get the idea. There's lots of very small decisions that are made here that are critical to the workflow of some people, but are found to be totally unimportant to other people, or just painful to have, in fact. And this one has not been implemented yet. There's an open pull request for this. I haven't managed to really give a solid decision on it yet, so we'll see what happens with that one. Where should no windows be placed in the tiled layout? We currently have two options for this. You can add them to the top of the stack or the bottom of the stack. Again, there's an open pull request for adding them to the middle of the stack. Or, you get the idea. These are subjectively good features. These are the things that are totally valid to want, but they're not necessarily what I want and not what I want to maintain. Here's another one. Should tags be shared between multiple monitors or separate for each monitor? Right now, under River, we've got a separate set of tags for each monitor. What I mean by tags are these numbers up in the top left. You can focus multiple of them at once. They're kind of like workspaces, but a bit more flexible. And right now, there's a totally separate set of tags or workspaces for each monitor in your multi-monitor setup. Right now on my computer, I've got a separate set of tags than you see up on the screen, for example. And this is something that I didn't give too much thought to at the beginning, because I didn't have a second monitor when I started writing River. And so I just kind of did what DWM did and what other people did and had totally separate sets. But at some point, I bought a second monitor, and I started to rethink this. And now I'm not sure if I actually like it this way. I kind of want to change it. But it's also other people that also have second monitors prefer it the way it currently is. And this is a kind of deep-seated thing in River. Like, it'd be very hard to make this a config option. I don't think it'd be worth the complexity, really, to make this configurable. And so we kind of need a better solution to this kind of subjective versus objective feature thing. We need some way to implement subjective features and allow experimentation there without just blowing up our maintenance cost, because maintenance cost grows super linearly with the number of features. Every feature and the interaction between the features adds new sources of bugs and new things that need to be tested when testing new code. And I don't really want to just break everything and switch to the feature set I want. I'm not even sure what I want yet. I'm still experimenting and learning what works for me when it comes to window management. And so I really want something that promotes experimentation and allows playing with new subjective ways to manage windows. So let's look at one example. A common feature request is to have a way to always open a program on a specific tag. And this is something that's kind of basic, but we don't have it yet because I haven't had a satisfying way to implement it yet. So I mentioned briefly we've got this thing called the float filter, which allows you to start a program in floating mode. This is a pretty basic thing that I just implemented kind of without thinking too much about it, just because I wanted my terminal to open in floating mode sometimes. And so how this works is that you add app ID, Firefox in this example, to the float filter, and then if you start Firefox, it opens floating. It's pretty simple. So what would this look like for the tag example? We could have a start on tag 3 filter add option to start Firefox on tag 3. But does this scale? Do we need to add a different filter for every possible action we want to do when starting a program? I don't think that this does scale. I think that's a bad design decision, and I think we need to move away from this filter-based approach. So what if we unify this into a single command that can do a lot of different things whenever you launch a program? Well, if we make it flexible enough, we're basically inventing a kind of scripting language that kind of applies arbitrary rules based on some patterns to match app ID titles of programs. It kind of seems like we should just use a scripting language, right? Wait, we already have some scriptable behavior with our layout generator program, this river tile separate binary that determines how the windows are laid out that I showed you guys earlier. So how much window management policy can we move out of the compositor process to this layout generator? This is what I want to explore now going forward with River. The trade-off here is, of course, latency. If we have to do a round trip between the compositor process to this layout generator process and back for every time you open a program, every time you press a key, for example, this could have unnecessary overhead with regards to latency. But if you think about X11, we already have this overhead there. On X11, there is a separate compositor. There's also a separate window manager. And so on X11, for example, when you press a key, it might go from the X server to the window manager, to back to the X server, to the application, back to the X server, to compositor, back to the X server, then get rendered on the display. So I think it's probably going to be OK. I don't have hard numbers. I haven't tested it yet, but I think it's going to be OK with latency, as long as we make the protocol sane. Perhaps a window manager would be a better name than layout generator if we move all the window management policy to the layout generator. This would be a kind of new split for Wayland. I don't think there's any current Wayland compositor that has a separate window manager and a well-defined protocol for that. And this, I think, could allow a lot more rapid experimentation. There's a lot of stuff involved in writing a Wayland compositor that is not directly to do with window management. Most of the work is kind of dealing with the nitty-gritty details of the Wayland protocol and handling a lot of edge cases with regards to how clients display pop-ups and subsurfaces and enable hardware support for various features like variable refresh rate, which I mentioned earlier, which we don't have yet in River, just because I need to do some glue code to enable some features of the libraries I'm using and glue stuff together. So there's a lot of stuff involved in writing a Wayland compositor that's not directly related to window management. And so it'd be nice to share the burden a bit more and have a nice abstraction that you could play with new window management ideas while relying on the same like, battle-tested compositor base. So my thoughts going forward in this is that I want to first just focus on making the compositor process unaware that tags exist and that workspaces exist at all. I want to stay away from handling any kind of mouse processing in this window manager process, because that requires a lot more thought in regards to latency tuning and potentially a lot more events going back and forth. So I want to keep that all in the compositor for now, but I want to move all of the keyboard, or most of the keyboard shortcut handling to this separate window management process, and also all the window management logic. And if I can design a protocol that makes the compositor totally unaware that tags exist, and leave all the layout option and window management behavior to this compositor project, I'd be pretty happy with that. So once we've got that protocol, I'm going to do a basic implementation in Zig, of course, first. But Zig also has some downsides for rapid development and trying out new ideas very quickly. Zig is not perfect for everything. It's a very, very good language for writing a compositor. I love the low-level control it gives you and the safety guarantees. But I also want to try out some other interpreted languages that are dynamically typed just because they're nicer to use as a configuration language. If I move in this direction of code as configuration, I think it'd be nicer to use Lua or Scheme or something similar to that for the high-level logic of this window manager process. So this is my overall design direction that I'm planning to go with River. That's all I've got for you guys today. I hope you guys have got some good questions, and these are links to River if you want to follow along this project. My website also has blog posts with somewhat irregular status updates. And feel free to join us on IRC if you have any questions in the long term, or reach out to me during this conference. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Isaac. Yeah, I think it's interesting that the first objectively good decision, good feature to add was changing keyboard layouts, because now I remembered you also started making people switch to Colimac.
Yes, I did. Though I'm actually using QWERTY on this computer right now because I wanted to relearn QWERTY.
Oh no, that's why you have so much fun.
Yeah.
So, wait, you're going from ortholinear, because you have a corn, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So ortholinear to staggered, split to non-split, Colimac to QWERTY.
Yeah, well, I'm still going to use the weird keyboard for for long-term programming, but I decided I should probably still be able to type on normal keyboards too.
Have you seen,
Otherwise,
what
it's
I
too.
did? I have
Oh,
a
nice.
Colimac MacBook.
That's impressive.
Think about it. I did surgery on this stuff. Okay, so does anybody have any questions? Raise your hand. Oh, okay, I see. Okay, few hands.
Go
Let's
for
not
it,
reach
Lois.
Is trolling okay or? Hello. Did you consider YAML as your configuration?
No, I did not.
So you mentioned Lua and Scheme, which both seem pretty good choices. I'm all for a good Lisp in the right place. Have you considered Lola, talking about in-house stuff?
Well, I have not considered Lola yet, but the advantage of this divide I'm proposing, making the window manager process completely separate from the compositor, is that everyone can implement their own window manager process if the protocol is well defined. And so you can really write a window manager in whatever language you want. Mm-hmm. That means you can write it in Lola or bring back Xmonad, write it in pure Haskell, you know? That's part of the beauty of what this approach, of why this approach is nice and why I don't want to just put the scripting language right in the compositor process. I think partly I want to do that because I think the abstraction of the protocol, if done correctly, will make both code bases a lot cleaner. And partly just to keep it kind of open for experimentation and make it fun to hack on. Because I don't want to, what I don't like is like not being able to merge changes to the compositor process because I'm worried about breaking stuff. I wanted to have the compositor process be like this really solid, kind of immutable code base that just does the objectively good things and then exposes this protocol for people to do whatever wild ideas they want on the window manager side. Objectively, well, subjectively bad things. They're subjective features. Yes.
So I think you've kind of answered a little bit of this, but I was curious, why was the layout generator moved to a separate process?
This is a pretty early thing we did in the River design. At first, it was like just a binary we would call that would then receive some arguments on the command line and then print some window dimensions to std out. Just because this is something I wanted to play around with early on, just like have some way to write different layouts without having to patch the compositor source code. I used DWM kind of briefly before this, and I really hated like compiling C code to change my configuration. And so I was looking for ways around that, and that's like one idea I came up with early on. Though we then moved it to use the Wayland protocol instead because it ended up being a lot cleaner just to integrate with the compositor since it's already a Wayland compositor and to just have a nicer abstraction and allow more flexibility in the window management protocol.
Is anybody writing their own layout?
Yes, there are quite a few. There's links on our GitHub wiki if you look there.
Isaac, first of all, this looks really cool. I'm probably going to install it as soon as I get back to the hotel, even though I should be finishing this class.
Careful, it doesn't support mirroring.
When I get back home then. Yeah, I relatively recently started messing around with Sway, and I've heard of River, and so this gives me an excuse to try it out. You caught my attention when you were talking about objectively good versus subjectively good features, and a window management system like this seems like such a massively user experience oriented project in a very open-ended way. A long time ago, I think it was like, I used to be really into configuring software and tweaking it, and then I switched over to the fish shell in like 2015 and my brain exploded, and I think after version 3 of that, I was like, a burden was lifted off my soul because I no longer wanted to configure it anymore because it took care of about 95% of my needs out of the box. So I guess my question for you is more about defaults. How do you answer the question of what's the right default for any configurable setting?
That's a very good question. And that's like the downside of making everything super scriptable is that then you've kind of got to tinker with it to make it work how you want. My answer there is that what I hope to see long term is that there'll be window managers that aren't configurable, that just do one thing and imply their opinionated defaults to the user experience. And so you would have then a selection between different window manager implementations that can collaborate with the River compositor project to then have just a nice out-of-the-box experience. But I think short term, I want the flexibility of like just configurable dynamic scripting languages just to experiment and figure out what I really want when it comes to window management. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, that's great.
Isaac, are you turning Wayland back into X11?
No, this is why. So I originally had on my earlier slides this like diagram, this classic diagram of the Wayland architecture where it doesn't show the window manager as a separate thing. But then I took that out because that's what I'm doing. I'm bringing that back, and that's why I use this other differentiating feature for Wayland, the mechanism versus policy, to kind of demonstrate why I think Wayland's a good idea, even if I think window managers are also a good idea. And it's kind of, I don't know if I've talked that much about how pervasive this is in the X11 model of how things are done. Everything just has, the clients just do the things however they want to do them. And so that's also one thing that makes compatibility between X and Wayland pretty difficult, because X11 clients have like 7 different ways of opening a pop-up window when you right-click to open this little drop-down menu. And you've got to handle all 7 different ways of doing those things. And usually, the worst ones will like use just absolute coordinates, and so it doesn't work if you have gotten your second monitor. It'll just appear on your first monitor no matter what you do, and there's not really anything you can do about it. Yeah, X11's a pretty big mess when it comes to that. And this policy versus mechanism isn't a perfect fix. Expressing the policy in the protocol does introduce a lot of complexity there, because you've got to be a bit more specific about what you want. You can't just rely on the client to do what it wants. You have to have the client must describe what it wants and then communicate that to the Wayland server. But I think it does produce a more flexible environment, and it's more friendly to the user, because you don't have clients taking over the desktop. Instead, the clients must describe what they want, and then the compositor, which is configured by the user, allows them to do that if the user wants them to allow them. If the user wants to allow them to do that. Yeah, that's kind of my spiel on why I think Wayland's a good idea, or at least worth exploring.
Talking about user experience, River is running 0.9.1. Thank you for that.
That's right. Yeah, I do.
Did you try running this on like master, like compiling River, and how much days you will need to spend for that?
So I tried this about a month ago, updating River to master branch, and I didn't get terribly far. I did get sidetracked into implementing like explicit backing integers for packed structs, because I wanted that for the ABI boundary for my different like WL roots and libwayland bindings. I need to try this again. I haven't found time yet. I'm probably need to find the time when I get back from this conference, or maybe during this conference. I don't know. But it's definitely time for me to try and update for master branch again.
A couple more questions. Yeah.
Was there any objectively good feature in the past that you wanted to implement and hopefully also did implement where you needed to change a lot, like change course somewhat?
River has not yet had very major course changes in direction. I think this split of moving things out of the main compositor process into a separate process will be the first like really major breaking change we've done since we tagged 0.1. I guess the largest change before that was moving from this kind of ad hoc STD in, STD out based layout configuration to a Wayland protocol. But I've been very conservative actually as it comes to these subjective features so far in River's lifetime. I don't take breaking changes very lightly. I hate breaking changes as a user, and so I try to inflict as few as possible.
Okay. Andrew, last question.
Does OBS and Steam games work with River?
OBS does work. Last time I tried it, it's been a while since I last tried it, so things probably work better now, if anything. You can screen share as well in Firefox using WebRTC. You need to get Pipewriter and a little bit of dbus stuff set up for that, which is a bit annoying, but it does work. Steam also works fairly well. It depends a bit on the game, though, how the game interacts with full screen and whatnot, because again, these games run through Wine through X11 usually, and X11 then has a billion ways to make things full screen and grab all keyboard input and do that kind of thing. However, a Wayland port is coming to Wine, so eventually Wine will support Wayland directly, which should make things a bit nicer. And there are workarounds. There's this compositor called GameScope, which is also developed by one of the WL Roots maintainers who also works for Valve as a consultant, which is kind of like a pass-through compositor. It runs one game inside like a nested Wayland compositor, and then that gives you more control over how that is then displayed in your Wayland session. That's what's used in the Steam Deck, for example. So yes, it's possible. It's not like frictionless yet, but it's definitely possible.
So Steam Deck is Wayland?
See, a Steam Deck uses Wayland, yeah.